Anyone with even a hazy knowledge of the Cold War fully understands that it was a period not only of aggressive direct competition between the reigning superpowers, but also of grand schemes by both the US and the USSR for incorporating their allies and clients into adversarial blocs, as well as poaching the rival powers' partners, particularly in the developing world, into their own camp. Throughout much of this period, the West viewed claims of neutrality by poorer nations with skepticism, if not outright hostility. Beginning with the Eisenhower administration, there was a widespread belief in Washington that non-alignment was merely a pose and that those who declared it had already begun an inexorable slide into Moscow's grip. The Soviet Union, for the most part, agreed. Moscow felt it could afford to be tolerant of the non-aligned because it had far less wealth than the United States or its collection of allies, many of which were then reluctantly transitioning one by one away from imperialism. The Kremlin believed that the greater the distance newly independent countries established between themselves and their former colonizers, the more likely they would adopt a worldview sympathetic to socialism. In many economic discussions, it is always discussed how some of the early to middle Cold War era rivalry played out in Africa. In 1956, sensing the imminent end of the age of colonial rule, then Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev abruptly pivoted his country's foreign policy to invest much more political energy and financial resources in cultivating the so-called Third World, and Africa quickly developed into a priority theater for the Russians. At a moment when domino theories were still being debated in the West, the United States and its European allies were forced to make their own pivot, and they suddenly began paying much more attention to Africa than had previously been the case, particularly for Washington. Development assistance became a major feature of Western foreign policy. African leaders began to visit the White House and European capitals in droves. And a small, then not so small industry of economists, other social scientists, and non-governmental organizations was born, with the goal of assisting in the difficult puzzle of development and, incidentally, for the latter group, the NGOs, to capture some of the government's generous budgetary outlays. What is lost in this purposefully streamlined narrative, which is underappreciated both in popular memory and among mainstream historians, is the energy, resourcefulness, and creativity demonstrated by many African leaders during the transition out of colonial rule amid a raging Cold War. Following Ghana's independence in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah led the way, furiously attempting to devise a strategy that would quickly lift his country out of poverty and into the ranks of middle-income or even industrialized countries. He recognized that he needed engagement and assistance from both the West and the East to accomplish this, so he joined the Commonwealth and maintained surprisingly flattering relations with Queen Elizabeth, as well as US President John F. Kennedy and his wife. Kwame Nkrumah, an unapologetic socialist, believed that by doing so, he would gain the opportunity to pursue productive relations with the Soviet bloc and a policy of bringing African countries together under the banner of Pan-Africanism. In his development agenda, the dual priorities of securing continental unity and positive engagement from the world's major powers were matters of African survival. However, the fierce Cold War competition at the time did not allow him much leeway, and Nkrumah was deposed in a coup orchestrated by the CIA in 1966. Other African leaders of the time were given even less leeway. Following Ghana's independence in 1958, France under President Charles de Gaulle punished Guinea for refusing to join a paternalist Paris-led community of newly independent African states. To set a good example for its other African colonies, the French abandoned their former colony almost immediately, trashing everything from government records to office furniture, abandoning hospitals and ripping out phone lines. Playing one superpower off another, on the other hand, became more normalized over time and ceased to be the domain of left-leaning governments in Africa. Despite being the US's most important client on the continent during the Cold War, Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, whom the CIA helped install in power, eventually flirted with both China and North Korea. Ethiopia and Somalia, rivals in the Horn of Africa region, switched allegiances in the late 1970s between Moscow and Washington. And Angola, a steadfast Marxist client of the Soviet Union, wisely gave the American company Chevron the lead role in producing oil from its Cabinda enclave, on the theory that business interests would help temper America's anti-communist fanaticism during Angola's long foreign-backed civil wars. Beyond such acrobatics, what is most impressive about the 1960s in Africa is the breadth and depth of economic and political experimentation on the continent, as well as the resourcefulness and imagination of leaders, beginning with Nkrumah, who desperately sought to forge a path toward greater prosperity. Equally impressive, and perhaps more importantly, each of these attempts resulted in a dead end, regardless of ideology. These include the agro-industrial state capitalism forged in Côte d'Ivoire in the 1960s and 1970s by the conservative Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who for a time used commodity exports and migrant labor to make his country appear to many to be an economic miracle story. They also include Julius Nyerer's Tanzania, which aspired to move his country forward in an egalitarian direction through collective agriculture, and a homegrown socialism completely lacking of ideas like class struggle and emphasizing industrial-led growth. From left to right, others tried an impressive variety of strategies during the 1970s in many African countries, and by the 1980s nearly everywhere on the continent, this economic and ideological experimentation had failed. And people in much of the continent were thrust back to per capita levels of income no better than what they had known at independence. In fact, this is the central and unacknowledged challenge that Africa poses to the rest of the world in the 21st century. No one seems to have a good idea of how the continent that will see the vast majority of the world's population growth in the coming decades will achieve the much higher economic equilibrium that is sorely needed. Today, far fewer brains and even fewer good will appear to be devoted to this question, one of the most pressing issues confronting humanity in the 21st century, than there were in the early 1960s. And although we are a long way from the cut-and-slash great power competition of the Cold War, the strongest and wealthiest countries of the world show no sign of working together with the nations of Africa, nor even, frankly, of competing among themselves to help solve these problems and fundamentally improve the situation on the continent. For far too long, Africa's economics challenges have been written off in a morally dubious manner. The standard, self-explanatory explanation for its low progress has been corruption or a combination of bad decisions and incompetence. To be sure, there have been plenty examples of these, but African corruption is unlikely to be very different in extent from the corruption seen in many other times and places. And the so-called bad choices of African governments must be weighed against the constantly shifting and often disastrous advice they have received over the decades from the outside world and against the courageous, if so often forgotten, struggles of leaders in the early independence era to find a place for their nations in a global economy. The very same global economy that is happy to extract wealth from Africa but otherwise remains hostile towards African development.